My name is Ernest Smith, and I'll be your moderator for the debate tonight. And we've invited you here to hear from two great minds on one complicated and complex subject, the existence of God. And the existence of God is a very broad topic, and so what we wanted to do is narrow it down to really two questions. And the first question is, does God exist? And the second question is, does it even matter? So those are kind of the two questions that these individuals, our guests, will be addressing tonight with us. We're really excited to hear from both of them. We do want to give thanks to two groups that are helping host this. The first group is The Well, which is the college and 20-somethings ministry of Seacoast Church in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And the second organization is the Atheist Humanist Alliance organization here right on College of Charleston's campus. We're so thankful for both of those organizations and for all they've done so far to make this event a success and what's happening. Again, our debate is on the existence of God. These two gentlemen, they've met before. They've debated each other before, so we thought, why not have a round two with each of them? We're so thankful to have Dr. Herb Silverman here with us, and then Mr. Jack Hoey Jr. as well. We're thankful for him. And I'm not going to spend time now giving you their biographies because you can find those in the program that you should have received as you came through. You can read a little bit about them. That's also the place you can write down questions. The format tonight will follow as such. We're going to give both men 12 minutes to introduce and to do introductory remarks. Then we're going to give both of them 5 minutes to rebuttal those. Then we're going to give them a time to just have a dialogue and ask each other questions and to go back and forth. And then we'll have a time for you to ask questions, and then we'll end with 5 minutes of closing remarks from each of them. So with that being said, Mr. Herb Silverman, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let your 12 minutes begin when you get to the podium. So thank you.
And thank you very much for arranging this. I'll begin with what I don't believe, and then, more importantly, what I do believe. I'm an atheist. An atheist is simply someone without a belief in any gods. I can't prove there are no gods. I just don't have any evidence for such beliefs. That's also why I don't believe in astrology or in alien abduction by UFOs. Carl Sagan said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Claims about God are certainly extraordinary, and I have yet to hear good evidence. It may surprise you to know that Jack and I are both atheists, with one tiny difference. You see, there are over 7,000 gods that people believe in, and Jack is an atheist with respect to all gods but one. I simply don't make that one exception. I think religious belief arose out of fear and confusion about the mysteries of nature, which people attributed to acts of gods. Countless scientific discoveries have since changed God beliefs. Most people no longer attribute natural phenomena like thunder, eclipses, earthquakes, and floods to supernatural causes, though 38% of Americans still do. Scientists know there will be a total solar eclipse on December 26, 2038. And it won't be a sign of God's displeasure with our behavior. I understand the appeal of religion. Fear of death can lead to a longing for an afterlife where we can be reunited forever with our loved ones in eternal bliss. Or perhaps we can come back reincarnated as better people. Many have felt the presence of Allah, Vishnu, Shiva, and numerous other gods that neither Jack nor I believe in. Religious beliefs can be quite comforting, but it's important to distinguish between the world as we know it and the world as we'd like it to be. We know how to distinguish good scientific ideas from bad ones. Science relies on experimentation, testing, and skepticism. It thrives on disagreement and on a willingness to question assumptions critically while we search for evidence until a consensus is reached. That's why scientific truths are the same in Pakistan, the United States, Israel and India, countries with very different religious beliefs. How can we distinguish good religious beliefs from bad ones? Do we choose our God beliefs based on evidence, or on a careful scientific study, or after deciding which religion has the most reasonable faith? I think not. As it turns out, there's a remarkable coincidence. The overwhelming majority choose the religion of their parents. I learned to believe in the biblical God, Yahweh, not Jesus. Why? Because I was born into a Jewish family. Had I been born into a Christian family, I would likely have believed that Jesus is Lord. Most Asians are Buddhists. People from India are mainly Hindus. Saudi Arabians are Muslims. And here in the United States, we have mainly Christians. Religious belief is clearly based more on geography than on theology. And every one of these religions think they have the truth with a capital T. Now, with all the conflicting faith beliefs in the world, they cannot all be right, but they can all be wrong. Believers, whether in astrology, tarot cards, or religion, look for and notice validation for their beliefs, while they tend to overlook or downplay opposing information. This is known in psychology as confirmation bias. The easiest way to believe that the Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God is to disregard any evidence that contradicts claims in the Bible. Such belief is wishful thinking, not critical thinking. The question today is about whether a God exists and whether belief in God matters. Now I'll address the does it matter part. In many religions, belief does not much matter. Deists, like many of our founding fathers, believed in a creator God who set the laws of the universe in motion and then retired to deity emeritus. But belief or non-belief in such a God does not matter. Millions of Hindus believe in many gods, and that when we are reincarnated, it doesn't matter whether or not we believed. The same may be said of Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, and Taoists. Universalists believe that God's creation is perfect and everyone goes to heaven. One of the early Christian church fathers by the name of Origen was a Universalist who believed that we would all be saved by a loving God. But Orthodox Christian councils later condemned as heresy a belief in such a tolerant God. Some Christians believe that God preordained only a select few for salvation, and there is nothing you can do about it. So your personal beliefs really don't much matter. On the other hand, many Christians and Muslims have faith in the kind of God who will reward with eternal bliss those who believe in just the right way, and condemn everyone else to eternal damnation and torture. Since belief trumps behavior, obviously the right kind of God belief is absolutely critical and of ultimate importance. And for these people, belief certainly does matter. Now, reasonable people may disagree about whether some kind of God exists, but to me, the far more important question is how we conduct our lives. Though I don't believe in any gods, I do believe in many things. As a secular humanist, I believe that ethical values are derived from human needs and interests and are tested and refined by experience. I believe we gain knowledge of the world through observation, experimentation, reading, and critical thinking. I believe we're part of a natural world, the result of unguided evolutionary change. I believe morality should be based on how our actions affect others. I believe that our deeds are more important than our creeds, and that dogmas should never override compassion for others. I don't think we should give credit to a deity for our accomplishments or blame Satan when we behave badly. I believe we should take responsibility for our actions. Should we subscribe to the same beliefs as those writers who lived some 2,000 to 3,000 years ago in a small corner of the Mediterranean world? Some biblical wisdom is certainly worth keeping, like love your neighbor and don't murder, steal, or lie, but these practices are necessary for the survival of any culture, with or without religion. The science of the Bible, which describes a flat earth with 4 corners resting on pillars at the center of the universe, is demonstrably false. Also, some biblical morality is now considered immoral, like slavery, treating women as property, anti-Semitism, executing blasphemers and homosexuals, and burning witches and heretics. Churches, on scriptural grounds, once defended such practices. For instance, Southern Baptists became a separate denomination over the issue of slavery. Here are the words of Richard Furman from right here in Charleston, who was president of the State Baptist Convention and founder of the university that bears his name. The right of holding slaves is clearly established in the Holy Scriptures, both by precept and example. Jefferson Davis added, slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible in both testaments from Genesis to Revelation. And what do we do with passages like 1 Corinthians? Women were made for the sake of man. It's good for a man to not even touch a woman. However, it's better to marry than to burn. Or 1 Timothy, women must keep silent and not have authority over men. Thousands of women were burned at the stake over one biblical passage, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Countless Jews were murdered by Christians because of passages like Matthew 27. The blood of Jesus will be on all Jews and on their children. John 84, the devil is father of the Jews. And gay bashing persists because of biblical passages like those in Leviticus, which calls homosexuality an abomination punishable by death through stoning. Do religions say that God changed his mind? No. Secular improvements forced religions to clean up their act. Even those who believe in biblical inerrancy now reinterpret some passages today in a manner more consistent with secular humanist principles. Secular morality has a flexibility and responsiveness to social change, and this is absent in ancient holy books. Morality evolves over time as our understanding of human needs within a culture change. We make judgments about which portions of a sacred text to take literally, which to take metaphorically, and which to ignore completely. I don't believe in any gods, but even if I did, such a belief would have no impact on the kind of life I lead. What is important to me is how we treat each other regardless of our theological beliefs. Honesty and integrity need not depend on a belief in the supernatural. We don't have to believe in a certain type of God or in any God in order to be kind and compassionate to our fellow human beings. So now you know what I don't believe and also what I do believe.
Thank you, Hoey. Mr. Jack Hoey, turn over to you.
Thanks for coming here tonight. We're here to talk about a couple of big questions. Is there a God and does it matter? And Herb has outlined why he thinks the answer is no to both. I believe that there is a God, and I believe that the answer to this question matters profoundly, because the answer provides the basis for the meaning of life. If there is a God, then our existence implies a purpose, and discovering that purpose would logically be our most important concern. Now here's a paradox. We're talking tonight about a question of fact, of reality. If Herb is right and there is no God, then I am wrong. And furthermore, I'm wasting my life in the pursuit of a delusion. I'm making a catastrophic mistake, not a small one. On the other hand, if I'm right, then Herb must be wrong. It can't possibly be true that both of us are right. The other side of the issue, though, is that we can't know with certainty what the facts are. I don't see how you can prove God exists or that he doesn't. The major monotheistic religions, monotheistic being the religions that believe in one God, all teach that God transcends the material universe. He's distinct from his creation. Science centers on making testable hypotheses about observable phenomena. So if there is a God, he is outside that range of inquiry. He's not an object you can analyze with empirical methods. It makes no sense to say science proves that there isn't a God. Many people think that this is what science does say, that to believe in God means you have to close your eyes to all that science has learned. Sam Harris says in Letter to a Christian Nation that faith is belief without evidence. But I would argue, if you look at the science, it's harder to be an atheist than it used to be. And let me say here as a preface that I disagree with any idea that there can be some kind of religiously based science. In my view, science has to be radically agnostic because it has to be free to follow wherever the evidence leads. I simply think that the existence of a creator is the most reasonable interpretation of scientific evidence regarding origins. In the absence of proof, one's conclusions come down to weighing evidence that sometimes conflicts. Different people weigh things differently. I think that intelligent people can disagree on whether there is a God. So before we go further, let me distinguish between two positions, which I'm going to call belief and faith. Belief is an intellectual assent to the probability of something. It's a theory that you hold in a realm of thought where proof isn't possible. And frankly, that applies to most things outside of mathematics. Faith, on the other hand, is a response that we make to a person. It requires commitment. Belief risks nothing. When we hold a theory, we can always change it if we have new information. But faith is risky because you have something at stake. Now, the question, is there a God, is a question of belief, not faith in the way that I'm defining those two terms. It's an intellectual assessment. More than 90% of the human race believes, and has always believed, that there is a God. For most people, it's a reasonable inference to make from the order and harmony of their environment. I don't think this should be dismissed lightly. We all have beliefs that we haven't bothered to intellectualize, that nonetheless are accurate. Our minds operate intuitively in many ways. Most people intuitively sense that the most reasonable explanation for existence is that there must have been a creator. Now, one question that's sometimes posed is, well, where did God come from then? Think about it this way. Why is there something rather than nothing? If anything exists, then there must be something that came before it. And if you follow that trail all the way back, you eventually come to something that exists that you can't account for, something that has always existed. Now you can take your pick at that point. Either there's a God who's always existed, or it's the universe. But it has to be one or the other. Something has always existed. Carl Sagan used to say, the universe is all there is, or ever was. Virtually no one disputes today that the universe had a beginning. Most scientists agree that it began about 14 billion years ago with an event that we call the Big Bang. Some people have tried to explain how this event could have occurred without a God, without a cause. Those that I've read seem very far-fetched to me. I spent 25 years of my life manufacturing things, and I can tell you that I have never seen an undirected process, no matter how simple, produce a coherent, satisfactory result. So the idea that an explosion produced our huge, complex universe randomly without any guiding intelligence seems unlikely to me. Okay, so what about evolution? First, I want to clarify something. There are two different things that people sometimes confuse when they talk about evolution. First, living thing we know of had antecedents. For humans and animals, it's parents of some kind. And as we watch species through generations, they tend to change over time. Sometimes in ways that seem significant and persist. Sometimes in ways that don't. This is so undeniably true that I don't see how anyone could argue with it. But we sometimes conflate this idea with Darwin's theory of natural selection, which argues that life is the product of purely random processes. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down. Darwin assumed that simple forms of life spontaneously came into existence and then evolved into more complex forms over a long period of time. Not an unreasonable inference in 1859. But since his time, we've gained the technology to study what goes on inside a cell. And we've learned that there are no simple forms of life. The simplest life form we know of, a bacterium, is unimaginably complex. The birth of the first one required the perfect assembly of many enzymes. And each enzyme required the perfect assembly of many amino acids. And if I told you the odds against this happening, you'd probably think I was exaggerating. Most theories of biogenesis, or the beginning of life, have concentrated on the chemistry of life. But life is more than chemical reactions. All cells store, process, and replicate information. A gene is a set of coded instructions with a precise recipe for manufacturing proteins. In other words, semantic information, a code, a language, if you will. I don't understand how a code could emerge spontaneously from a collection of mindless molecules. Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of DNA and no friend of religion, has said that so many things had to come together for life to begin that it would, quote, almost require a miracle. That's an ironic choice of words, I think. If you need a miracle for your belief system to take place, it seems to me to be more consistent to think that there's a God behind the miracle than nothing behind the miracle. Now, what if that makes sense to you, but you still have doubt? I hope you always have doubt. Doubt is the response of intelligence to life. You do not have, and you will never have, all of the answers. You will never have perfect information on any decision that you make. The issue isn't whether you doubt, but what you do with it. Now, I made a distinction earlier between belief and faith. I think the evidence supports the intuitive notion most people have always had, that God exists. In other words, I think that there is a good, reasonable case for belief. But that really doesn't take us very far. How do you move beyond belief to faith? If there is a God, what is God like? And how do you learn about that God? If God is outside of space and time, there's no way for us to discover it. The only way it can happen is if God takes the initiative and reveals himself to us. For Christians, that's where the Bible comes in. It records God's initiative to reveal himself to human beings. The Apostle Paul wrote that all Scripture is inspired by God. And the central thing the Bible teaches is that if we want to know what God is like, we need to look at Jesus Christ, because Jesus embodies God as a human being. And the Bible explains how Jesus fulfills God's plan for the redemption of his creation, which includes us. Because of Jesus, we can have a relationship with God. And this is where faith is really different. It centers on a relationship. Now, I've been married for 30 years. And when my wife Penny and I were dating, I tried to think through, as objectively as I could under the circumstances, whether we could be compatible for the rest of our lives. I mean, all I want to do is be with this woman, but I'm realizing that at some point I'm going to turn into my parents. Is it going to work at that point? It doesn't matter how well you know the other person. Marriage is always a leap of faith. And here are a couple of characteristics of that kind of faith. One is you have to be receptive to change because your life is no longer completely your own. You're inviting someone to have an equal share in your future. Second one is that your partner will test your love. They'll do things that you find incomprehensible. And when that happens, there will be times when you need to trust the person that you know who stands behind the action you don't understand. You need to interpret the action in light of that person. And the third dimension is that you need to have humility because you are accountable. You're no longer the only person who determines whether what you've done is acceptable. Now, that kind of relationship is not irrational, as anyone who is happily married can tell you. But it doesn't lie in the realm of objective thinking, does it? In the same way, faith is at some level irreducibly subjective. Some people argue that we need to exclude everything intangible, everything that can't be verified from the decisions that we make about God. But in my mind, that would exclude everything that's most valuable in life. And I think that would be truly irrational.
Let me say that I agree completely with Jack in one instance. Marriage is a leap of faith. And I'm glad we've both been successful with our faiths. Jack says we can't prove or disprove God's existence with science. He's right, but we can prove that the science of the Bible is false. And if the Bible is mistaken in telling us where we came from, how can we trust it to tell us where we are going? Jack also says that nobody disputes that the universe had a beginning, and he says processes just don't come into existence. Well, the Big Bang is a quantum event, and quantum theory particles do just come into existence. We don't yet know how our universe began, or whether we live in just one of multiple universes spontaneously created from nothing, as Stephen Hawking argues in his latest book about M-theory. This sounds incredible, as do all origin stories, but at least Hawking gives scientific arguments to back up his view. Jack says that science can't explain the origin of life. He's right. In science, it's okay to say we don't know. In the absence of conclusive evidence, the default position should not be to believe things that comfort us, but rather to withhold judgment. To say, science doesn't have the answer, therefore God did it, is known as the God of the gaps argument. Abiogenesis is a study of how biological life arises from inorganic matter through natural processes, and the method by which life on Earth arose. There is empirical evidence for possible explanations, like the Miller-Urey experiment, which demonstrates how organic molecules could have spontaneously formed from inorganic precursors like those present in early Earth. The French mathematician and astronomer Laplace did groundbreaking work in proving the stability of the solar system. The Emperor Napoleon asked Laplace why he didn't mention a creator, and Laplace said, "I have no need of that hypothesis." I expect that one day we will have a complete understanding of the universe, and a future Laplace will explain to a future Napoleon why the origin of the universe needed no God hypothesis. Jack also says that the universe is too complex to just exist. But Jack believes that the universe must have been created by an even more complex God who just exists. If everything has a cause, then that God must have one also. And if something doesn't, it might as well be the universe. Jack says that evolution is a random process. But evolution is not a random process. Random variations lead to mutations sorted by natural selection, where those with the highest number and quality of offspring will survive each generation. That's why natural selection explains the diversity of life so well. Natural selection breaks improbability into small pieces with slowly increasing complexity. This creates the illusion of a planned design which could not be achieved in a single step. But what's impossible in 100 years may be inevitable in 1 billion years. Jack also says he is wasting his life if he is wrong about his beliefs. Jack, I do think you are wrong about your beliefs, but I don't think you're wasting your life. Do you find no pleasure or satisfaction in this life other than preparing for an afterlife? Since no religion claims a majority, do you think most people just waste their lives? You might want to take into account the words of two of my favorite philosophers. Bertrand Russell said, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge." And Robert Ingersoll said, "Happiness is the only good. The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make others so." Thank you.
Just to try to respond to a few things, Herb. One of the things that you talked about was that religion originally arose out of fear and confusion. And I guess the way that I would characterize what you said with regard to why people would believe in it now, some people still believe that thunderstorms apparently are bolts from the hand of God, but most people that believe now believe because it comforts them or because there's some wish fulfillment aspect to their belief, and they allow themselves to believe these things because of a confirmation bias. They recognize evidence that supports what they want to believe. There's a book that came out within the past few months, many of you may have seen it, called The Believing Mind. And the author, I can't think of his name offhand, but makes that argument that that's the way our minds work. The thing that I would say is that that's true for all of us. That's not just true for people who believe in a God or in a religion. All of us tend to believe evidence that confirms what we want to believe. Steven Weinberg, a physicist who is a very prominent atheist and a kind of a cutting-edge thinker, expressed the reason that he is an atheist essentially is because of the Holocaust. The evil that God, if there was a God, allowed to happen convinced him that there couldn't be a God. So science is a way that he comes to terms with what he's decided to believe. Now, many religionists have much cruder beliefs than that. But I think that what we need to be aware of is that confirmation bias is something that we all have to struggle against because we all have reasons to believe certain things. Herb, your comments on that science is based on experimentation, testing, and criticism, I was hoping that you might agree with my point that science needs to be radically agnostic. But I don't think that the arguments for the creation of a universe out of nothing, without a God behind it, are quite as definitive as you would argue. Stephen Hawking's argument that the universe kind of quantum fluctuated into existence from nothing. But nothing was this chaotic space-time foam that has this stupendous energy density, and you're still left with the question is, why is there something rather than nothing? And what do you want to believe came first? Now, I'm not trying to argue that that means that a creator came first. I'm trying to argue that you have to pick something. Hawking also acknowledged that his arguments had nothing to do, quote, says nothing about whether or not God exists. His thing was that the universe follows the laws of physics, and that the laws of physics determine how the universe began. So that's not an argument about God's existence or not. It's just an argument that if there is a God, he's not arbitrary. Your point that geography determines religious beliefs? I would make 2 points. One is that geography also determines cultural beliefs. And the moral values that you express, Herb, which I agree with, I think they're very worthy values. But they're impossible to imagine outside the cultural context that you grew up in. Regardless of your religious beliefs, you were shaped by a culture that has Judeo-Christian origins. The religious belief argument is an interesting one because what Herb says is true. Most people grow up believing what their parents believed. So the question then really becomes, how do you account for those who don't? So in China, in the last 125 years, the church, the Christian church, has essentially gone from 0 to about 100 million adherents. Exact numbers aren't easily available, but 100 million adherents. You can't account for that by parents teaching their children. Today, is that happening? Sure, but you started with 0 and you've had dramatic growth that far outstrips the population growth of the Christian population. Saying that geography determines it is like kind of saying that you're accounting for motion using velocity only without acceleration. And the final thing that I would say is that, Herb, I've concluded that your problem with the Bible is that you're a radical fundamentalist. You insist on interpreting literally things that were never meant to be interpreted literally. The flat earth on pillars is from, that he's quoting Psalm 75, which is a poem. Now, poems, by definition, I think, are not to be interpreted literally. When Shakespeare has Hamlet talk about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, we're not looking for projectiles flying all over the stage, right? We understand that that's a metaphor. A lot of the Bible is history, and to record something is not to affirm it. Otherwise, you'd have to say that every historian that has written on the Holocaust agrees with the Holocaust. You know, I guess the final thing that I would say is that it's easy to look at the history of Christianity, a couple of thousand years, millions of adherents, and find a lot of appalling things. But I think the question that you need to really address when you're talking about some of the ills that we all know about, slavery, the inequality of women, racism, is not why do they exist, why did religion allow them to exist, but how in the world did they ever come to an end in the West? That's really the thing that we have to account for. Were there Christians on the wrong side of all those issues? Absolutely. But ultimately, the reason that those things have been abolished in the West is due to statements like this from the Apostle Paul. There is neither Jew nor Greek, so racism is excluded. Slave nor free, so slavery is wrong. Male nor female, so men and women are equal. For you are all one in Christ Jesus.
I do want to mention, Jack, that I'm really not a fundamentalist. And I, like most people, want to decide what parts of the Bible to believe and what not to believe, whether something is a poem or not. And I do believe some of the good things in the Bible, just like I do some of the good things in the Quran, Aesop's fables, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. But I would like to know, for you, how do you decide what parts of the Bible to believe? For instance, was Adam the first man, and did Eve come from his rib? And along those same lines, were there talking snakes, and did a 600-year-old Noah put pairs of all animals in an ark, including polar bears, who just happened to be living in the Middle East at the time?
Or they had a long walk.
Especially when you're...
Well, you know, it's interesting. So the first 11 chapters of Genesis and the examples that you chose all stem from that. That's really a difficult question in terms of how you interpret that part of the Bible. Because it's the part that is really the prehistory part of the Bible. Everything else in the Bible came after the invention of writing. So you can at least have some kind of a sense that perhaps these things were written down at approximately the time that they were supposed to have occurred. But the first part of the Bible, is that something to be taken literally? If so, how literally? I do think that parts of that first initial part of Genesis are poems. Genesis chapter 1 reads like a poem to me. It's a very highly stylized literary form. And, frankly, if you read Genesis 1 and take it literally, then you've kind of got to explain why Genesis 2, the paragraphs that follow immediately after, contradict the order of events that's described in the first chapter. So, to me, it doesn't make sense to interpret it any other way than as a poem about the creation. Were Adam and Eve literal people created by God from the dust of the ground? Good question. I mean, I would tend to say that that's probably the most reasonable way to interpret those passages in Genesis. So I would provisionally say, yeah, I would, if you said, Jack, do you personally believe in Adam and Eve? I would say, yeah, provisionally, I would agree that those were the first people. Now, that also is a lot less far-fetched than it might have seemed 30 years ago. 30 years ago, people were arguing that the human race had a billion-a-year tail, and that evolution proceeded very slowly. So there wasn't, how could you say who was the first human? But what genetics have argued, the science of genetics has argued in the last 30 years, is that modern humans did not evolve gradually. They appeared all of a sudden and within the last 100,000 years. So to argue that it's possible that the biblical account bears a resemblance to the truth, I think that there's some scientific evidence for that, actually. Now, the Noah question is an interesting one, because for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, God said there was going to be a flood. Noah, you better build a boat. And then it says, when the flood was ready to come, all the animals came to Noah 2 by 2 and got on the boat, and that's how all the species were preserved. I'm just trying to think about, I think there are 10,000 different species of beetles. I mean, really? All the beetles marched from the Amazon? I mean, right, that doesn't make any sense, does it? I think one of the things we've got to be careful about when we interpret, what is in this case a Bronze Age text, is what did people mean by what they were writing? The Bible is not a history of the planet. It is not a history of the human race. It is not intended to answer all of the questions that we might have about how things got started. It's the history of God's dealings with human beings. Now, there is a fair amount of evidence to indicate a major flood in the Middle East, some thousands of years ago, not 6,000 or 4,000, but in the era of modern humans. And that's what I think the Noah story is about, is that it reflects this regional flood that was devastating to all the people that Noah and his family knew about.
Well, Jack, we do agree on some things, that this is not really a historical document, and some things were poetry and made up. And you do think that Adam, perhaps, or someone, was the first human. And I think that's probably fundamental to your beliefs in Christianity. And I think there has to be a snake involved, a talking snake, that tempted Adam to original sin, which supposedly contaminates all humans, which is why we need a blood sacrifice to save all humans. In fact, Albert Mohler, who is president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who Time magazine called the reigning intellectual of the evangelical movement in the U.S., says the Adam and Eve story goes to the heart of Christianity. The whole point of the crucifixion and resurrection was to undo Adam's original sin. Without Adam, the work of Christ makes no sense. So are you saying that you need to believe this Adam, Eve, and talking snake story, as does apparently mainstream evangelical Christianity?
Yeah, well, the talking snake, we look at it as a talking snake because a lot of painters in the Renaissance period and before were trying to figure out how do you paint a serpent, and that was their guess. So the deceiver, in the garden is referred to as a serpent, and what's that? Don't know. Might it have been a snake? I guess so. I mean, it doesn't really matter to me. The thing that I would say is that there are two issues. One of them is, I'm looking at the prehistory part of Genesis and saying some real questions about what we do with that, partly because we don't know the source of those documents. We don't know where that information came from. My other argument would be that that's less than 1% of the biblical text. And if those are the only questions that I had, I'd be pretty satisfied. The second thing, though, the story of the fall. Whether you interpret that metaphorically, as many Christians do, or whether you interpret it literally, I think it does express something fundamental. And that is that good and evil is inextricably bound up in human beings. The way that Solzhenitsyn put it was, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. So what the Bible teaches is that man was originally created in God's image, whatever that means. I don't think that means that God has eyes, nose, and a face, but that we bear some imprint of God's goodness and creativity. At the same time, we're all flawed. We're all marred. And the balance between those two is, I think, one of the things that makes human beings fascinating. It's also, to me, one of the things that makes the Bible story ring true. So, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I just need to find my questions. So, Herb, one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is that we both believe that being a good human being does not depend on being a believer in a particular religion or in any religion at all. Now, my question would be, how do you define good, and do you think that good, or the difference between right and wrong, can be objectively determined?
Well, I think we can't define, as you point out, it is somewhat culturally bound, but I think not harming others, trying to treat others kindly. We learn from experience things that haven't worked in the past in terms of how we treat others, like having slaves, treating women poorly and the like. Mm-hmm. That a lot of it is experience and seeing how things work better. So if I went to the Bible as a guide, I would find problems. You quoted a passage that made things seem right because you're a good person. Others will quote alternative passages that are horrendous. I think that we should be very careful in discussing whether it's helping or harming humanity in general when we decide what actions to take and how to treat others. For instance, let me bring up, I talked about African Americans, women, Jews, and I think we've gone beyond some of those things. Our culture is now changing in our treatment of gays and lesbians. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on how what your views are and how that is consistent with the biblical view?
Sure. I'm going to share my view, but I also want to just make the point that this is an area where there's a lot of disagreement in the Christian community. There are Christians on both sides of these issues. The Bible teaches in some areas that homosexuality is wrong. It also teaches that love and acceptance should trump judgment. And a lot of Christians argue that the passages that teach that homosexuality is wrong get in the way of us accepting and loving homosexual brothers and sisters that we should be caring about. I certainly agree with that. The thing that I would say, Herb, is that, my view is that if there is a design, if God designed the human race and designed men and women for lifelong relationships, then when we don't follow God's design, there are consequences. One of the things that's argued is, but what do you do with someone whose natural desires tend in a different direction? I understand that, and that's hard. And I certainly don't want to put myself in a position where anyone thinks that I am judging anybody. But let me give you an example. I have two people that are very close to me that are alcoholics. And one of them is, I think it just seems to me that he's in a downward spiral. He's destroyed one family. He's in a second family that he seems to be in the process of destroying. The other one also lost his family and made a decision that he needed to turn his life around. And so about a year and a half ago, he made the decision that he was going to work to be sober. He joined Alcoholics Anonymous and so on, and he's been working hard at that, and he's been walking that path. Now, my analogy there is, which one is doing the thing that comes naturally? I don't think that we would agree. I think we would agree that it's not the one who's making the best choice. Now, I'm not trying to draw a comparison between alcoholism and homosexuality, but I'm trying to use the example because I think that sometimes, particularly in our culture, we have the view that things that feel natural are right. And that's certainly not what the Bible teaches, and I can't say that that's what I believe. Now, the other area that this often touches on is, so what do you believe about the rights of gay couples? Should they be allowed to marry? To me, that's a political issue, and again, there are Christians on both sides of that. I certainly think that everyone should have equality under the law because that's the system that we live in. Now, what does that look like? There's a lot of disagreement on that right now, isn't there? Depending on what state you're in, you've got a majority on one side of the issue or another. My view is that just because something is sin doesn't mean it should be illegal. There's a list in, I think it's the book of Proverbs, of 7 things that God hates, and the list is often referred to as the 7 deadly sins, and one of them is gluttony. And but I've never heard any Christian argue that supersizing your fast food meal should be illegal.
Well, I'm not sure where to begin on that. If you oppose gluttony, and presumably you mean sexual promiscuity, it seems that you would favor a monogamous relationship between 2 committed men or 2 committed women within marriage. I just don't understand, other than by quoting biblical passages, why you think there's something inherently immoral for 2 loving and committed people of the same sex to have sex with each other, where it's not if 2 people are of opposite sex. Can you say a little why, other than just the Bible saying it's a sin?
Well, what I'm saying, Herb, is that the Bible talks about marriage as being a union of a man and a woman. Now, some people say, well, wait a minute, is it possible that that's not meant to be prescriptive? There are people that argue that, and my view on that kind of is that life will out, that if that is true, then over time that will become apparent. And if it's not, if that's something that people are trying to force onto life that is not true to life, then the attempt to do that over time is going to fail.
But Jack, you're quoting selectively from different parts of the Bible.
Okay.
What
do you think? What do you think I'm ignoring? I guess I'm.
Okay, I'll tell you. Who was who was considered the wisest man at one time? It was Solomon.
Right.
Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Yes.
So apparently his brain wasn't his most powerful organ.
Yeah.
And Abraham, who's a prophet, he had okay, so it's okay to have a man with 700 women, but it's not okay to have 2 men together.
Well, why do you think? Where do you get that the Bible says that what Solomon did was okay?
Well, according to the Bible, God certainly rewarded Solomon for what he did, as he did Abraham, who had 2 wives, and one of the wives was the slave of the other one as well.
So flawed people can still receive
But-
grace. That seems like good news to me.
But but see, this at the time it was written was not considered flawed. And I think the issue is people, as you said, in terms of Genesis, it was humans writing stories that made sense to them at the time, where the earth seemed flat, so they wrote that way. So I think you're agreeing with me to some extent that maybe the Bible isn't as divinely inspired as you claim it is from Genesis through Revelation.
No, Herb, what I would say, using the Solomon issue is that the books of the law, which were predated Solomon by many centuries, clearly said that you were to have one wife. Solomon flouted that, and what the history of his reign records is that it ended up destroying his kingdom. So, and not that God brought that about as a special punishment for Solomon, but that it was in part the result of the mistakes that he made. So, I don't see the inconsistency there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do you want to ask me a question?
I would love to. Herb, one of the things that you said, and I think this was exactly, I wrote it down accurately, was that you believe in ethical values derived from human needs and experience. Kind of two questions about that. And I think you also talked about how values essentially were derived from nature, from the world that we live in, and from the reality that surrounds us. I guess two things puzzle me about that. One of them is, nature. When I look at nature, what I see is violence by the strong against the weak. That's what the animal kingdom is about, uniformly. So, is nature unnatural? I mean, that doesn't seem consistent with the values that you espouse. And it makes me wonder whether you believe that if we develop our values based on human needs and experience, that we'll all end up with the same conclusions.
Well, I think through evolution we have evolved. I think the human animal tends to be more moral from our perspective than some other species, where the genes that have been passed on are the kinds of genes where people showed altruism because that was a survival mechanism. Yet at the same time, we still have to have certain basic views about treating each other kindly and how to improve, and sometimes go against what our natural desires might be personally because of the harm it does to others. So we do need guidelines. I just question whether your holy book is the best guideline, or if maybe the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or some other holy book or some secular humanist books are the better guideline, as I feel. And I think it's largely an accident that you were born in this country rather than in Saudi Arabia, where you would look for your moral guideline in the Quran, which in parts will contradict the views you have about morality. So that's an answer to you asked the question. Okay. Now, let me ask you a question, because you want to follow the Bible, and in particular the New Testament, and your belief that belief in Jesus saved you. So let me ask you, if you believe that the resurrection story is necessary to be saved, does it matter, for instance, if someone is a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or an atheist, if they live a good life?
Well, what the Bible says, and what I believe, what the Christian faith teaches, is that the going to heaven thing, right? What your eternal destiny is does not depend on how good you are. It depends on whether you believe.
So belief is more important than behavior, is what you're saying?
Well, Yeah, so here's one way to think about that, Herb, because it's kind of I realize that is a very different way for us to think about it in our culture. And particularly because religions are so generally associated with morality. Most people who don't study religion think that that's really what religion is about, is to teach us to be good. But Kierkegaard explained it this way. If you look at the Ten Commandments, the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, then he goes on to talk about, you shouldn't kill and you shouldn't steal. And why is that a commandment? Why does it come first? The primary way to define sin, theologically, is that it's not just doing bad things, but it's making good things into ultimate things. The opposite of sin, another place Kierkegaard said, the opposite of sin is not doing good, it's faith. So, the way that it's framed in the book of Romans is that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The issue in terms of destiny, what the Bible teaches, is that all of us are unworthy of an eternity with God.
Jack, can I just comment
Sure.
on your statement about having no other gods, the first commandment?
Okay.
That's right, but because of having no other gods, there were so many religious wars among people who believed in different gods or worshiped God in the wrong way. Then what this country was founded, when we have our Constitution, the First Amendment to the Constitution conflicts with thou shalt have no other gods. It guarantees freedom of religion, the freedom to worship one, many, or no gods. And that, to me, is a more moral way to live among other people than to insist that there's only one God and you need to worship that one God in a particular way or else.
I couldn't agree more if we're talking about the structure of a society, which is what the Constitution is intended to preserve.
Isn't that what the Bible was supposed to do as well?
No.
Okay.
No. The Bible is written to us as individuals, basically. And each one of us is ultimately accountable for the decisions that we make about what we believe. So, no, the Bible isn't intended to say, hey, Jack, here's what I'm teaching, and you have a right, for example, to impose your will on other people. That's not true at all. I've got a right to try to determine how I'm going to respond to God, but not to impose my beliefs.
But if you respond to God in the right way, however you treat your fellow human beings might not matter so much, because God has forgiven you for your sins and you go to heaven, whereas somebody who's treating fellow human beings kindly but happens not to have your belief goes to hell. Is that right?
Well,
in your view?
Yeah, what it really says is that we each get the destiny we choose. And, well, which, if you think about it, what do you do with toddlers? Any of you have ever raised a toddler or maybe had a younger sibling? You've got to watch them like a hawk, right? As soon as they get mobile, you can't ever let them out of your sight, or you've got to keep them in a pen somewhere so that they can't get themselves into trouble. So as children grow, they get more freedom because they're able to handle freedom. And when we become adults, then we have the ability to make our own decisions. God is treating us like adults. He's saying, you can choose me or not choose me, and your eternal destiny is what you choose. It is an eternity with me or an eternity separated from me.
Except for one thing. God never said that to me. He may have said that to you, and the idea from all the experience I know is that a good way to live a life is to treat others kindly, and I like to base my beliefs on what evidence I have. God has not shown me any evidence. If, say, you're right, and I die, and I learn there's a God, I would say, okay, you just gave me some evidence. Now I believe. Why would that, in your mind, be too late? Why is he just having this faith test?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. You can answer mine when you feel like, but
Well,
go ahead. Ask me
I
a
think it's actually
question
my
first
turn,
if you
but-
like.
In the interval before death, Herb, what evidence would it take to convince you that there is a God?
Oh, possibly if suddenly a bunch of graves started opening and people got resurrected, if the Ten Commandments were suddenly on the moon for all to see.
Yeah.
Instead of Jesus' resurrection being talked about just in the Bible and his not on outside sources when historians were writing at the time, and he only appeared to a small band of followers according to the New Testament and no other sources. That, to me, does not constitute evidence. And let me ask about the evidence that you have from the New Testament, that Jesus, as you know, wasn't the only New Testament figure to rise from the dead around that time. According to Matthew 27, graves were opened and lots of Jews were resurrected and went to Jerusalem, where they were seen by many. Again, there are no sources outside the Bible for this extraordinary claim. Wouldn't we have expected to hear something from the resurrected and their relatives, like what it's like being dead, how long they stayed in Jerusalem, and whether they returned to their graves? These are things that inquiring minds would want to know.
Yeah.
So how do you account for the fact that nobody outside of the Bible wrote about this incredible event?
Yeah. Well, if it was a parade down Main Street, you're right. I think it would have been more widely publicized. But when Matthew talks about the graves being opened and these people appeared to many, so who did they appear to? What makes sense to me is that they appeared to the same group of people to whom Jesus appeared after his resurrection. And what was the purpose of that? It wasn't to convince people by a shock and awe demonstration of, hey, there really is a God and you better get straight, because that wouldn't be treating people like adults. That would be taking choice away, wouldn't it? It was appearing to people who believed, who had been shaken by the fact that this person they thought that was the Messiah had been killed and couldn't understand why that had happened. So they appeared, as Jesus did, to reinforce the faith of these people that I really am who I said I was. I am the Messiah, the Savior.
But it still seems, with all of these people appearing and being out for a while, you would have heard some story from historians like Josephus, who wrote 20 books about that era, but not one once mentioned an incredible resurrection story. Why, in fact, would Jesus want to keep it so hidden if his goal were to have evidence for people to then accept Jesus as Lord?
Well, again, so what does Jesus want people to believe? That he can zap anybody that he wants, or that he loves people and wants them to have a relationship with him? I mean, if God came on the stage today and started doing something that was miraculous and amazing, most of us would probably believe. Some of us probably wouldn't. But what does that do? Does that create a relationship? And that's what God created us for, is a relationship with him. So, again, I think that my conclusion for how to reconcile these passages is that freedom is important to God, that our choices are significant. One way that I think about it is that, some people will argue, one of the arguments that people will make against design is that, why would the designer design so many things imperfectly? And my response to that is, it's an unfinished world. And we're part of the ultimate path towards completion.
But what you're saying then is an all-knowing God created humans knowing that the overwhelming percentage of them would go to hell.
Well, that is certainly a possibility.
Okay, you may be right that there is such a God, but would you, from your human perspective, consider this a good God?
Yeah. So one question there is, if I don't see a purpose in something, does that mean that there isn't a purpose? if I don't see that something can be good, does that mean that it's not? You know, Herb, one of the points that I was making earlier about using marriage as an analogy for faith is that one of the things that we all do, because we're rational thinking people and we have standards that we've developed over time, we tend to judge the things around us. So one of the things that you learn in marriage is that your own judgments are not absolute, right? There's an equal partner who thinks they know just as well as you do, and probably better in some cases, and often they're right. What I hear you saying, Herb, is that if God doesn't meet your standards, then that means that God is flawed. And my argument would be, I think that there's another possibility there.
I think there's another possibility, too. I don't think there's a God that's flawed. But, I do make human judgments about what's good and evil. For instance, as you say, well, maybe God is good in a way we don't understand. Mm-hmm. Couldn't you say the same thing about Hitler? And maybe God had Hitler, as some people believe, cause the Holocaust so that Jews would then have a promised land to go to, which would bring the rapture more quickly. Some Jews believe that God caused the Holocaust for having Jews emigrate to Israel. Some Christians believe he did that so the rapture would come sooner. So you can believe all sorts of things, but again, I like to live an evidence-based life.
Yeah. Well, and there are people who believe all kinds of crazy things. Christians, people from other faiths, people of no faith. There's no question about that.
We want to go to a time of the audience asking questions, not keeping a tally or anything, but Herb, you've asked 9 questions, and Jack, you've asked 3. So do you want to ask any questions before we go? Okay. All right, so we want to take an opportunity for the audience to ask any questions that you may have after hearing what these guys have discussed. There's 2 microphones up here. What we're asking you to do is keep it below 30 seconds. And please don't give an explanation or a commentary, just a simple question.
Hello? Okay. I'd like to ask Herb a question. It's hard to stump him. What do you think is going to happen to you when you die?
I know exactly what's going to happen to me when I die. I'm going to medical school. Just like my Jewish mother always wanted me to do. I want to be able to use my body parts to the fullest while I'm alive, but I hope others will make good use of them when I'm dead, and that'll be my kind of immortality.
All right. We'll go over here.
I guess one of the biggest stumbling blocks with me, I'm a Christian, and one of the biggest stumbling blocks for me is not necessarily that people disagree, because I think people disagree in many things, but one of the biggest stumbling blocks for me has been why so much anger from a side. Like, for example, like I've never looked at unicorns and been like, unicorns, like if I don't think it exists, why is there so much anger that arises towards something that I don't think exists? That's just, I guess maybe you can.
Did I ever sound angry at God in this discussion?
I'm not talking about you. No, you've been very even keel.
Well, I know there are atheists who seem angry about religion. I don't think they're angry at God because they don't think there is one any more than they're angry at the tooth fairy. But sometimes I think they justifiably get angry at some of God's warriors who discriminate against them and maybe do physical harm because people are supposed to believe in only one way. So I think the anger is directed at humans, not at any deities.
Okay, and to be even, can we get Jack's response maybe for that too?
Well, you know, I don't think there is a reason there are a lot of people angry about a lot of different things, right? So, one of the things you may be referring to is that, if you look at there were several books that came out within the last couple of years by atheists that were all fairly angry books. Richard Dawkins wrote a book. Sam Harris wrote a couple. Christopher Hitchens, what was it? God is Not Great was I think the Hitchens book, and you had a lot of people who sounded very angry. Now, are there angry Christians? Sure. I mean, are there angry people all over the place? I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't connect that with atheism. I know a fair number of atheists, and I know some that are angry and some that aren't. So to me, that's a human issue, not a belief, non-belief issue.
Okay, cool.
Good. Over here.
This question is for Dr. Silverman. This is the second time I've seen you debate now, the first having been in Wilmington about a year and a half ago when you debated William Lane Craig. And I was struck then and was struck again tonight by the fact that it doesn't seem like the debate between the two of you tonight really concerns very much the existence of God or even the truth of Christianity, but rather the subtopic of the inerrancy of the Bible. And I guess I wanted to ask you, Dr. Silverman, you mentioned earlier a number of the deists, and we can think of people like Tom Paine, notably Ethan Allen, and especially Voltaire, who hated Christianity and all kinds of revealed religion, but vigorously defended the belief in God. And so I wanted to ask you that, quite aside from these criticisms of the Bible, or even the question of whether Christianity is true, that is, whether Christ rose from the dead or not, what are your reasons for thinking that the preponderance of the evidence points to the conclusion that there is no God?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would phrase it another way. To me, in order to have a belief, I need the evidence for that belief. Otherwise, I don't hold it. For instance, I could say that the universe was created just 10 minutes ago and that God planted false memories in all of you. You couldn't disprove that, but you don't believe it. Why? Because there's no evidence. And I don't have any evidence for a Christian God, a Hindu God, that Allah is God. And that's why my concern isn't so much even about whether there is a God as to how we treat each others. I would be perfectly happy if people believed in a God who doesn't care whether you believe in him, and all that he cares is that you do the right thing. A God who thinks that our action in this world is what's important.
So if I can just follow up, it seems to me that what you're saying is that that the side of theism is the side that has the burden of proof, or at least the burden of producing evidence. Mm-hmm. Whereas, from your point of view, the side of atheism, as opposed to agnosticism, the side of atheism has no burden of proof for its conclusion.
Well, let's first distinguish between atheism and agnosticism, because I think you're using a different definition. To me, I define atheism as without a belief in any gods. So I have no particular God beliefs, and I would be perfectly happy to change that if somebody gave me evidence. Just like if you're a Christian, you believe in Jesus. Why don't you believe that Allah is God?
Well, how would you distinguish your atheism from agnosticism then? I say what you're describing as atheism sounds exactly like what most philosophical dictionaries would describe as agnosticism. How do you distinguish your atheism from the commonly held usage?
I used to call myself an agnostic because as a mathematician, I can't give a proof one way or another. But then I heard different definitions of atheism, and the common one used in the atheist movement is without a belief in any gods. So whether you want to call that agnostic or atheist, that's what I am, and I'm going to continue to live my life as if there is no gods until I see evidence to the contrary.
Which means, if I can just clarify this one last thing, I'm sorry. Which means that you would say that the preponderance of the available evidence points to the conclusion that God does not exist. And my original question to you, which maybe you can answer subsequently, is Why do you think the evidence points to that conclusion? What are the arguments in favor of that conclusion? That's all.
You want me to? Again, it's just that there's no evidence that I have to change my belief, and the default position for me about lots of things, whether it's flying saucers or astrology, is I don't have a belief until I find the evidence.
Okay. We're gonna go over here.
All right, this question's for Jack. Being an atheist myself, I do agree with Herb that your way of living is more important than just your beliefs.
Mhm.
But I also know that a lot of theists do pull from the Bible and live their lives based on what the teachings that it provides. But I do know that there have been books that have been removed from the Bible. So, and then also you were saying that other parts can be interpreted in poetry, others in fact. And I was wondering, who decides what is interpreted metaphorically? Who decides what is interpreted literally?
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems as if you take that into aspect, that the entire book could be. Some people could interpret the very literal passages metaphorically, and the metaphorical passage literally. It's interchangeable. So who decides what is defined as what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, good question. And there's not a simple answer to that. The way that I would frame it is that the fact that there is variance on interpretation reinforces the importance of interpreting with a humble spirit, not being convinced that you know all the answers to what a particular passage means. You know, it's interesting, one of the things that I think that, and I will just say that I think that a lot of Christians really violate the spirit of that approach. And, you know, one of the things that is a caution to me is, you know, how did the Jewish leaders of the first century miss who Jesus was? Because Jesus, you know, what Christians believe is that Jesus was the Messiah that they had been waiting for centuries. Why did they miss that? Really because they were locked into an interpretation of this is what the Messiah is going to be like when the Messiah comes. So, you know, what I would say is that there are a lot of passages where it's plain, whether it's metaphorical or whether it's to be interpreted literally. There are others where it's less plain, and my feeling would be that the good advice would be to be less dogmatic when you're not sure. And we should also all be very careful about assuming that we should be sure about something.
And do you believe that if those books that were originally taken out or lost from the Bible were included in there, do you think that would radically change the Christianity mindset?
I'm not sure what you mean in terms of books taken out. You know,
I do know there were lost passages.
Lost. Well, there have always been disputed passages or disputed books, right? And you know, I guess what I would say is that maybe consistently with the approach I'm advocating, the Bible that most Christians use takes what you might say is the most conservative approach. If in doubt, leave it out, which seems like a reasonable way to process that information.
All right, thank you.
These are good questions. I just need to reiterate, let's just do one question, and let's not do any commentary with the question. I'm going to assume that these guys have heard most of these questions before, so you don't have to explain it. They probably know what you mean. So just please do a question and just one only.
Herb, do you believe that there's a purpose to human life?
The question was, do I believe there's a purpose to human life? I believe there are many purposes, and each of us needs to find the purpose most suited for ourselves. So I think we need to find our own purposes in life.
Over here.
My question is for Jack.
Mm-hmm.
You said, like, God is explained by the intelligence of physical existence. Before that was, like, the thought was even created in, like, Genesis and Moses, the ancient Egyptians believed that that physical existence was created by, like, the sun god who created all these other gods who then created the earth and also people. Mm-hmm. So how does your theory definitively prove the existence of Christian God. And not only that, if your God is so perfect and like is all controlling and is all knowing and he's created everything, then why did he put Adam and Eve in a garden with temptation in it? Like knowing that they would be tempted. He could have put them anywhere else. Like he created all of earth and he decided to put them somewhere where they would be subjected to that.
Yeah.
Just to be consistent, let's just answer one of those questions, or else we'll all have double questions in one sentence.
Yeah, well, and those are all good questions. I'd be glad to answer some of the other ones afterwards if I can't get to them. But, I don't think, and perhaps I wasn't clear, I don't think that scientific evidence is definitive in terms of proving that there's a God or proving that there isn't. I don't think it's definitive. I think it's a weight of the evidence thing, and that there is some conflicting evidence, okay? What I'm saying is that the weight of the evidence makes me think that belief is reasonable. But moving on from belief to faith.
But so is doubt.
Yeah, as I said, I don't know if you remember I said this, but my view is that doubt is the response of intelligence to life. And anyone who ceases to doubt isn't thinking.
It's good. Just so you and everybody else knows too, these guys are going to be here afterwards. We're going to have like coffee and donuts and stuff outside. So if you've got follow-up questions, ask them to stay around, okay? One guy likes donuts. It's good. Question.
Thanks. My question is for Herb. I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I got two simple questions, quickly. If God created Adam and other men, do you think there will be a third person in the world, in planet Earth? And the second question is, I know you're a good teacher, a good professor. Would you allow a student, a good one, a very smart student, who didn't get a chance to register for the semester, who did all the homework, and then would you allow her to go to the next level to be graduated afterward?
Let's just answer one.
Okay.
That's for eternity. When you die,
Okay.
would you heaven or not?
Let me answer the homework question. I think this fits into religion. Let's say, hypothetically, that I have two students. One says, "You were a great teacher. I really believe in your methods. I'm sorry I failed every exam." Another student says, "You were a horrible teacher. I had to learn all this stuff on my own, and I got A's in all the exams. Which one would I pass and which one would I fail?" I would not base my decision on who believed in me. I'd base it on their good works.
I'm sorry. You misunderstanding. No, what I mean, I'm sorry. A student who didn't register for the semester, but who came to audit your class, but who did everything well and submit you his papers or her papers, but because he or she failed to register for the school, would you allow that person, that student, to go to the next class, next level? You would not, right?
Well, it would not be up to me. I'd be happy to give that student a good grade. If there's some bureaucratic problem with it that's out of my control, I can't do anything.
Okay. We got it. Thank you. We got to go over here.
Okay, this question is for Herb Silverman. I'd just like to ask you, as an atheist, I'm sure you're aware of St. Thomas Aquinas' The Five Ways, one of the oldest classical arguments for the existence of God. One of his arguments was that we have a mover theory, that even if material existed eternally, that at some point it has to be moved or touched or bumped by something. And in essence, it goes along with Newton's cause and effect. So how, as an atheist, do you get around the theory of the first mover, that at some point material had to be moved?
Well, in terms of a first mover or a first cause, some people posit that first was God. Others say that the universe is uncaused. And even if as Jack talked about the Big Bang as the first cause, that would be about 13.7 billion years ago. And then for billions of years, we had bacteria, and eventually in a minuscule amount of time, we had humans. That does not sound like the kind of God that most religions believe in terms of how he would create the universe. But there are reasons to think there might not have been a first cause, and scientists are working on it now. It's unknown, and I remain unsure until there's more evidence, but that doesn't tell me how I should live my life, which is the important thing to me.
Question over here.
I would like both your thoughts on this. In response to how you did not like that eternity is based on belief rather than goodness of a person, that possibly that even one sin corrupts a person, and therefore no person is deemed good, so we need a proxy or a sacrifice like Jesus. And that's why the belief is so much important, because it's impossible to be perfect or good in the eyes of God. We are just applying this goodness on a human level, which is mainly subjective and arbitrary in our moral standings and relative.
Yeah, gee, I thought I was a tough teacher. But this is part of the problem, that, to me, that we're all corrupted probably through this so-called original sin. To me, what's important is what we make of our lives, not what our parents or grandparents were like. The idea that because of Adam, we're all corrupted, and then because of Jesus, we're all forgiven, that the fact that somebody's willing to take a murderer's place and die doesn't make that murderer good, and I don't understand why we shouldn't be responsible for our own behavior rather than what happened centuries or ago.
Can I say one thing about the question? Not really, I'm sorry, not really original sin, but any human sin. I mean, and it's impossible to live without any one sin happening.
Yeah, okay. It's impossible to live without doing something wrong. I agree. And if there's a God that says you go to hell if you made one mistake, okay, that might be. It's not a very nice God as far as I'm concerned, but you could be right.
Okay, let's go over here.
As a Christian, I just want to know, I know that not all this is directed to her, by the way. I know that not all Christians really act the same way, and I understand that. But I just want to know, as a Christian, why wouldn't I want to do what you consider good to glorify my God?
Well, I'm glad if you do, that's great. I would like all Christians to try to be good and treat fellow humans well, regardless of their reasons, whether it's to glorify God or just because it's the right thing to do, as many secular humanists feel. But please be good people.
Okay, I'm gonna ask no one else come to the mics, those that are already in line. You guys get your questions, and then we'll do closing arguments.
Jack, based on your morality, not God's morality, should Herb go to hell?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what you mean by my morality, but let me say a couple things. First of all, do I have the right or the moral standing to condemn anyone? No. No. I am no one's judge.
Okay.
Okay.
You good?
Sure.
All right, over here.
This is for Dr. Silverman. You keep referencing the fact that you'd like evidence before you would consider belief in a God. I was wondering if this story would be credible to you. A couple years ago, I had a really bad scoliosis on my back, which basically made me look like this. And went to the chiropractor, had x-rays done, and there was definitely a curvature in the spine, and caused some pain. And then I think 2 summers ago, I was on a mission trip in Ireland, and the altar call that night was about prayer. And so I went up and gathered with some pretty strong Irish Christians, and they started praying for me, and it was prayer very consistent with the Bible through Jesus to Yahweh, God of the Bible. And as you can see, I don't have a curvature in my spine. My shoulders are the same length and they weren't before that exact moment. I could actually feel it go down. And so I was wondering if you thought that story was credible.
Well, first, let me say I'm really pleased that you've been cured. Sometimes there are spontaneous cures, and that, what sometimes we call a miracle, something that happens very rarely. And it might be, as you believe, that it's because of God, but things do happen that rarely happen. That's just how science works. Now, let me just mention two different websites. One is a horrendous website put up by Christians, and it's called GodHatesFags.com. Now, there was another website to kind of counter that, or to make a joke of that, which is called GodHatesAmputees.com. And the reason for that other website is that nobody has ever been cured of having an extra leg grow. That's something that seems like it's so out of the ordinary, that's not going to happen. But there are many other kinds of spontaneous cures, and I'm glad for whatever reason that you're better now.
Okay, let's come over here.
This is for Herb, and I'm just asking in response to you saying that God has never spoken to you personally. And the Bible teaches time and time again, God says, seek me and you will find. So I'm just wondering if you've ever sought after him.
Well, I was once a believer. I grew up Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox synagogue, and I was a believer. And when I believed, I kind of thought, well, God was speaking to me in different ways. But gradually, I just recognized a lot of coincidences about that, and I started to try to think logically, do my beliefs make sense? I eventually reached the point that, no, that really wasn't any God speaking to me, and I've lived my life after that without hearing any gods. And I recognize that this was just my view that there was a God speaking because of my upbringing.
Okay, let's come over here.
Hey, how you doing? Mr. Hurd, it was good hearing your viewpoint. I just had a question. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but you keep mentioning the word good, and that it kind of comes from our knowledge and just how we have gained wisdom. My question is, Hitler would take good and he would say, well, it's a good thing to exterminate people that are holding us back from having like a super awesome race and kill the elderly and the disabled. Why would his definition of good not be credible, and like what standard would you use to discredit his definition of good?
Okay, may I suggest on the website you look at the principles and values of the secular humanists of the Low Country. But part of that is that you treat your fellow human beings kindly. You don't do unnecessary harm to anyone. And by all possibilities, Hitler was purposely harming people. Some of his views, incidentally, came from Martin Luther, who was very openly anti-Semitic, and the Nazis, for the most part, were Christians, almost half Catholic, half Lutheran, and they had Gott mit us, God is with us, on their buckles.
Okay, let's come over here.
Dr. Silverman, I have a question about your earlier statements on Stephen Hawking's, his theory of just the spontaneous creation of the universe. You cannot prove that theory scientifically. It's just a theory. And you also claim that you cannot prove the existence of God. It's merely a theory. So what makes the theory of that spontaneous universe a better theory in your mind than the existence of a supernatural God?
Well, right now, I accept neither the existence of a God or M theory. It may be in 100 years after I'm dead, M theory will be proved or disproved. I don't know. Just like physicists for a long time didn't know if we had a steady state universe or it was expanding. Eventually, we had enough science, and now everybody acknowledges, even those who are on the other side, based on the evidence, that we have an expanding universe. So I don't know, and my life has no bearing personally on how I treat you, on whether M theory with a multiverse is true or whether there's a God that exists. So I live my life the best I can.
Thank you.
Okay, let's come over here.
Sorry, Dr. Herb, this one is also for you.
Sorry, Jack.
I answered all the questions.
Right. If God or a force that defines good and evil does not exist, then what keeps me from defining my own morality, like saying to myself that for me, killing gays is a good thing? Like, what keeps me from defining that for myself?
Well, assuming you're not a psychopath, I think most people have this inherent feeling about what's right and wrong, and I think there's an evolutionary reason for that, that our altruistic genes have been passed on. So that if you look at countries that most likely don't believe in God, like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, their morality seems as good as people's morality in this country. I don't think you need to believe in God to be moral. And if you think the only reason you're not killing somebody is because of a fear of God, then I hope anyone in the audience who feels that way continues to believe in God.
Thank you. Over here.
Sorry, I'm a bit nervous. I had a question for Mr. Silverman. When you were talking about Herb's view of salvation, you used the metaphor of a teacher, and you said it would be foolish for a teacher to grade someone based upon their faith and not upon their works. My question for you is, if we were really being judged by our works and not by our faith, would a single more person get into heaven than under Mr. Herb's view? And would anyone?
Well, under my view, there's no heaven, so right, nobody gets into heaven. You die, and your good works will live after you.
Let's assume he meant Mr. Hoy's view.
Oh.
Well, I think he was, were you asking, where is this?
Who goes to heaven?
You said two names, and they both referred to the one person. So you were asking Mr. Silverman the question.
Yes, sorry, I got a little bit confused. What I was asking you is, if people were actually judged based upon their works and not by their faith, would that be any more generous, or would anyone here be getting into heaven?
Well,
if it did exist,
okay,
would any man
if
be
there was
justified?
a heaven and there was a judging God, I would think in terms of, there's certain standards that God would have on who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, I suppose, even though that doesn't make sense. But I know I sometimes agonize about one student, and it's a student, is this going to be the worst student who passes or the best student who fails? And it's kind of makes me think in terms of how would a God, if I posited the existence of one, distinguish between the worst person in heaven versus the best person in hell? And if you have free will, can you sin when you're in heaven and then turn around and go to hell? And if you don't have free will in heaven, does that make you just a robot? So, I mean, that's one of the reasons that this whole concept of heaven and hell is very puzzling to me.
Okay, thank you. Next question over here.
I have a question for Mr. Hoyt. We touched on this for just a second, but is there any way you can explain your views on homosexuality without confusing instinct with addiction?
Yeah. Yeah, and I apologize if I, by using the analogy with alcoholism, if I was implying that they were identical phenomena. But, you know, what I would say is that the point that I was trying to make with that analogy was that you used the word, not addiction, but what was the other word you used?
Instinct.
Say that again?
Instinct.
Okay, an instinct for something. My point would be, does an instinct for something, does a natural proclivity for something make it right? And I don't think it does. So, did that address your question? Or I'm not sure if I have.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
May I just comment on that too?
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, Jack. For instance, if people had a natural inclination toward child molesting, that would be wrong. But in my mind, if people have natural inclinations to have a committed, loving relationship with a fellow human being, that is not wrong. Preventing those kinds of situations, to me, is wrong.
Okay. And you get the honor of the last question, so it better be really good.
I'll try my best. My question's for Mr. Hoey. Dr. Silverman mentioned earlier that he believes that as far as creation goes, the initial creation of existence, that it's better to just admit that, okay, things were created and we can't necessarily explain that, but there were things created. Whereas, per my understanding of your belief, it's better to believe that there is a higher power that was that initial creator, but in all reality, if we don't have a creator for that initial creator, how does that, in all logic, make sense to you that there was this being that just became out of nothing? How does that make more sense to you than the universe itself and existence itself coming out of nothing?
Yeah, good. Well, what I said was that something has always existed, and that was either a god or the universe, or however you want to frame that, some precursor to the universe we're in now. And there's no way to be definitive about which it is. So my point was that you need to look to other things for your conclusions. And the conclusion that I was drawing was the origin of life. That the origin of life, not the beginning of existence, the origin of life was the sequence of events that in particular I found too complex to be explainable by random occurrence.
Thank you. Now we're going to take, allow these gentlemen to have 5 minutes apiece to do closing remarks.
Regardless of anyone's opinion of tonight's debate, I can objectively say that I have been more successful than was a 13th century rabbi in a debate with a knight. The knight began by asking the rabbi if he believed in the Virgin Mary and if she was the mother of God. When the rabbi said no, the knight quickly defeated his opponent by beating the rabbi and knocking him out. King Louis IX praised the knight, saying, "As soon as a man hears the Christian faith being maligned, he should defend it by the sword, with a good thrust in the belly as far as the sword will go." King Louis later became a saint, for whom we named a city, St. Louis. I'm so pleased that Christianity has evolved to become considerably more tolerant, and that I had as kind and considerate a Christian opponent tonight as Jack Hoey. My purpose here is not to convert you to atheism. Each of us must find a path that enables us to live healthy and productive lives while helping our fellow human beings. My purpose is to encourage you to think critically. Along these lines, there's a popular cartoon on the door of many mathematicians, which shows one mathematician explaining his complicated multi-step proof. Another mathematician interrupts and says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Step 2 says, then a miracle occurs. In Jack's arguments for the existence of God, I don't think he was explicit enough in his various versions of step 2. Some of your questions may have been answered tonight, but I hope you leave with more questions than you came with. One of the best ways to learn is through questioning and by hearing many sides of an issue. I hope you'll continue to read and study the Bible. It is an important part of Western culture, but I hope you'll also look at biblical criticism. With this in mind, permit me to put on my professor hat and give you your homework assignment. And that's to read the following 15 books. I'm not an easy teacher. The Evolution of God by Robert Wright. A Demon-Haunted World, Carl Sagan. Why People Believe Weird Things, Michael Shermer. Forged, Why the Bible's Authors Aren't Who We Think They Are, Bart Ehrman. The Gnostic Gospels, Elaine Pagels. The History of God, Karen Armstrong. The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins. God is Not Great, Christopher Hitchens, mentioned earlier. Good Without God, Greg Epstein. Freethinkers, Susan Jacoby. The End of Faith, Sam Harris. Breaking the Spell, Daniel Dennett. Why I Am Not a Christian, Bertrand Russell. Losing Faith in Faith, From Preacher to Atheist, Dan Barker. And Why Christianity Must Change or Die by Bishop John Shelby Spahn. I have copies of this list for those interested, so you can pick them up afterward. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone here, especially Jack, for this wonderful shared experience, which would not have been possible had you subscribed to the views of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:14. The passage says, believers must not commune with unbelievers. What fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, light with darkness, believers with infidels? And thanks to all of you for allowing this infidel to have fellowship with you.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if that was an accurate interpretation of what Paul was saying. I was thinking, if I was like King Louis, it would have been a very short debate.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I enjoy the exchange of ideas too. And one of the things I appreciate about Herb is that Herb's a careful thinker. And, you know, it's good for all of us to have challenges to our thinking because it's too easy for us to have blind spots and to believe things that aren't true because no one has challenged a false belief. So, you know, I always appreciate the chance to sharpen my beliefs because, as I said earlier, I know that I don't have all the answers and I never will. Herb said a couple different times tonight that, you know, the reason for his position is that he's found no evidence to change his belief. And Herb, of course, I can't speak to your personal experience, but, you know, it was interesting when I asked you what evidence would change your belief, you didn't really answer. And I think one of the reasons is that this is really a difficult issue. And I don't mean difficult in the sense that, you know, what we were talking about earlier with the issue of confirmation biases and so on. What I mean is that if faith, as I said before, is irreducibly subjective, then there are certain of us that tend to be more objective. We believe in what we can see and touch and feel. Faith is a more challenging thing. The deal, though, is that if ultimately faith is about a relationship, it requires that you be receptive. You can't have a relationship without being receptive to that relationship.
One of the people who asked a question earlier quoted the verse that said, "If you seek him, he will be found by you." And what I would encourage each of you to do is you explore what you want to believe, this personal thing that is so vitally important to your future. I would encourage you to consider that if you think that there may be a God, to seek that God. And my belief is that if you're seeking God, you'll find God. A lot of questions about the Bible that we've talked about tonight, and a lot of issues that I don't see that anybody can definitively answer. Very few of those issues arise about the Gospels, though. And the Gospels are historically substantiated in some unique ways. And there's some recent scholarship that in particular is remarkably confirms the reliability of the Gospel accounts. Now, here's the deal. Christianity ultimately depends on the resurrection. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, even though people don't do that, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then you should ignore Christianity, and frankly ignore everything it has to say. But if he did rise from the dead, then that's a reason to consider the other things that he had to say while he was here on this earth. Now, here's my thing with the gospel. The guys who were writing the Gospels, these came from eyewitness accounts. They were close enough to know whether what they were saying was true. There was no reason for them to lie about what happened because they didn't get rewarded for it. Many of them were tortured to death. Many of them were martyred. Many of them were exiled. There was no reason for them to say what they said unless they believed it was true. Could they have been wrong? Sure. And a group of delusional peasants changed the world. I mean, that's a little hard for me to believe. So, my homework for you would be, don't take my word for that. I would encourage you to read the gospel accounts on your own, form your own conclusions. It seems to me that something extraordinary happened that first Easter morning, and I would encourage you to find out for yourself what it was. Thank you.